I accidentally walked into the alien women's locker room, and now they don't want me to leave. Hudson had been walking for what felt like hours, though the station's ambient lighting never changed, and his phone had stopped trying to calculate local time somewhere around the third concourse. Orbital Station Zenith 7 was supposed to be a marvel of intergalactic cooperation, a gleaming hub where species from across the sector came together in harmony and mutual prosperity. What the tourism board had failed to mention was that it was laid out like a three-dimensional labyrinth designed by a committee that couldn't agree on which way was up. The signs didn't help. Half of them displayed symbols that looked vaguely threatening, like angry geometric shapes having an argument. The other half cycled through what he assumed were different languages, none of which he recognized, flashing past too quickly for his translation app to grab onto anything useful. He'd tried asking for directions twice. The first time, a being that looked like a floating collection of crystals had chimed at him in what might have been sympathy or might have been laughter before drifting away. The second time, something with too many eyes had simply stared at him until he'd backed away slowly, apologizing to what he hoped was its front. His original destination, the human embassy, a phrase that still felt absurd in his mouth, was supposedly in Sector 12, Ring 4, subsection something. He'd lost track. The map they'd given him at the docking bay had been a physical paper document, which should have been his first warning. It was currently crumpled in his pocket after he'd discovered it was printed in a spectrum of colors his human eyes couldn't actually perceive. Helpful. Hudson turned another corner into a corridor that looked exactly like the previous 17 corridors, except this one had a slightly different hum. The walls here were the same smooth composite material that seemed to make up 90% of the station, glowing faintly with embedded bioluminescence that pulsed in gentle waves. He'd thought it was beautiful for the first hour. Now it just made him nauseous. A door ahead stood slightly ajar, unmarked except for a small panel displaying a symbol he didn't recognize. But through the gap, he could see light, warm, yellowish light that looked blessedly familiar after all the alien blues and greens. More importantly, he could hear the sound of running water. Where there was water, there were people. Where there were people, there were directions. He pushed through the door and immediately understood he'd made a terrible mistake. The room was vast, far larger than the door suggested it should be, and filled with steam that rolled through the air in thick, warm clouds. The temperature hit him like a wall, and his shirt immediately began sticking to his chest. Tiled walls stretched up into a vaulted ceiling, the material shifting through subtle color changes, teal to turquoise to deep ocean blue. The hiss and splash of water echoed from somewhere deeper in the space. And everywhere, women. They stood at benches, sat on low stools, moved between what looked like shower stalls carved into the far wall. All of them possessed skin in shades of blue he'd only ever seen in deep ocean documentaries or expensive paint samples. Luminescent markings covered their arms, their shoulders, their backs, tracing patterns that seemed to flow and shift as they moved, like living tattoos drawn in light. Some glowed softly white, others in shades of silver and pale gold. But it was their ears that caught his attention, even through his mounting panic. Long and elegantly pointed, sweeping back from their heads in graceful arcs, the tips extending well past where human ears would end. They were beautiful and alien, and he absolutely should not be seeing them. For one frozen moment, nobody moved. The conversations died mid-sentence. The only sound was the continued hiss of water and Hudson's own thundering heartbeat. Then someone laughed. It was a musical sound, bright and genuine, and it broke whatever spell had locked the room in place. Suddenly, everyone was looking at him, and Hudson felt his face burn hot enough that he worried it might glow like their markings. "Wrong door," he managed, his voice coming out strangled. "So sorry, very wrong door. I'll just—" He took a step backward and collided with the door, which had apparently closed behind him. His hand scrabbled for the panel, found nothing but smooth wall. The door had no handle on this side. Of course it didn't. A woman stepped forward from the group, taller than the others, her markings pulsing in what might have been amusement or might have been warning. She said something in a language that sounded like music played underwater, her tone clearly questioning. I can't." Hudson gestured frantically at the door, at himself, at the room in general. Lost, very lost. The signs are terrible. Has anyone mentioned the signs are terrible? More laughter rippled through the room. Several women had moved closer, forming a loose semicircle around him, their expressions curious rather than alarmed. He supposed he wasn't exactly threatening, soaking with sweat and radiating panic. The tall woman spoke again, slower this time, as if that would help. When he could only shake his head helplessly, she tilted hers to one side, studying him with eyes that were several shades darker than her skin, almost violet in the strange light. She reached out and traced a symbol on the wall panel beside the door, a flowing, complex design that appeared in light under her fingertip. The door emitted a soft hiss, followed by a heavy mechanical clunk that echoed through the chamber. Hudson stared at the door, then at her. "Did you just lock it?" Her smile suggested she understood his tone, if not his words. Behind her, the other women exchanged glances and whispered among themselves in that musical language. He wasn't getting out of here anytime soon. Hudson pressed himself against the door as if he could somehow phase through it by sheer force of embarrassment. The tall woman with the pulsing markings remained in front of him, her expression shifting from amusement to something that looked almost apologetic, though not apologetic enough to actually unlock the door. Behind her, the other women had resumed their conversations, though their eyes kept drifting back to him like he was a particularly interesting exhibit at a museum. "Look," he said, trying to keep his voice steady and his eyes focused firmly on the ceiling, "I understand this is awkward for everyone, but if you could just open the door, I promise I'll leave and we can all pretend this never happened. I'll even file a complaint about the signage. Really scathing stuff, multiple paragraphs." The tall woman tilted her head the other way, her long ears shifting with the movement, and said something that sounded like a question. When he didn't respond, she held up one finger in a universal gesture of "wait" and turned to call out to the others. A younger woman with markings that glowed a softer silver detached from a group near the showers and jogged over, holding what looked like a compact disc made of crystal. She was grinning openly, clearly delighted by the situation. The crystal device projected a holographic interface into the air between them, symbols and text scrolling past in a dozen different scripts. The young woman tapped several commands, and a synthetic voice emerged from the device, speaking in accented but comprehensible English. "Greetings, unknown biological entity. Please state your designation and purpose." Hudson blinked. "Is that thing translating?" "Affirmative," the device chirped. "This unit provides linguistic bridge between Veleric Standard and your apparent communication method. Please state designation." "Hudson, my name is Hudson." He looked at the tall woman, who was watching the translator with obvious satisfaction. "And my purpose is to leave immediately, with everyone's dignity intact." The young woman spoke into the device, her words emerging in that same stilted English. "Human. Male designation Hudson. Query. How did male human access restricted Veleric facility?" "I didn't access anything," Hudson said, gesturing at the unmarked door behind him. "I got lost. Your station is a nightmare of confusing corridors and signs that I'm pretty sure are just making fun of me at this point. I was looking for the human embassy and ended up here by accident." The translator conveyed this to the tall woman, whose markings pulsed brighter for a moment. She responded, and the device translated, "Cultural liaison Lyria expresses confusion. Human males are restricted from Veleric sector under trade agreement terms. Your presence represents diplomatic irregularity." "Trust me, my entire life is a diplomatic irregularity," Hudson muttered. "Can we resolve this irregularity by opening the door?" Lyria spoke again, longer this time, and the translator struggled to keep up. "Negative. Station protocol requires documentation of all unregistered biological anomalies before release into general population. You must remain until documentation specialist arrives to record your—" The translator paused, clearly struggling with the next phrase. "Unusual meat configuration." "My what?" "This unit apologizes for translation difficulty. Your physical structure must be cataloged for station records." Hudson rubbed his face with both hands. Of course. Of course his terrible sense of direction would land him in a situation that required paperwork. "How long will that take?" The young woman consulted with Lyria, then turned back to the translator. "Specialist Sora has been summoned. Estimated arrival, 47 minutes. 47 minutes, Hudson repeated flatly. He looked around the locker room again, careful to keep his gaze moving quickly past anything too personal. The women had mostly returned to their routines, though several were still watching him with unconcealed curiosity. "And I have to stay here? In the locker room?" "Affirmative. Door security engaged. Attempting exit will trigger station alert and potential defensive measures." "What kind of defensive measures?" The translator made a sound that might have been the device's version of a shrug. "This unit lacks specific data. Recommendations suggest not attempting discovery." Hudson slid down the door until he was sitting on the floor, his knees pulled up to his chest. This was fine. This was absolutely fine. He'd just sit here in an alien women's locker room for 47 minutes while they documented his unusual meat configuration and tried very hard not to think about how he was going to explain this to literally anyone ever. Lyria said something that sounded almost sympathetic, then gestured to a bench along the wall. The young woman with the translator spoke. "Cultural liaison. Lyria suggests you relocate to seating area for comfort. She assures you that Valeric females mean no harm to strange lost human." "That's tremendously reassuring," Hudson said. But he got up and moved to the bench, grateful to have something solid beneath him that wasn't a door. The bench was made of the same color-shifting material as the walls, warm to the touch and surprisingly comfortable. He sat down heavily and tried to remember if his travel insurance covered intergalactic incidents. The young woman sat down beside him, still holding the translator, her markings brightening with what he was starting to recognize as excitement. "This unit is called Mira," she said through the device. "Mira has never encountered human male before. Many questions exist." "I'm not sure I'm the best example of the species," Hudson said. "I can't even read your signs." "Signs are coded in chromatic spectrum visible to Valeric biology," the translator explained. "Human visual range insufficient. This explains your navigation difficulties." Hudson stared at her. "You're telling me all your signs are in colors I can't see?" "Affirmative." "That's the worst design choice I've ever heard." Mira's markings pulsed in what might have been laughter, and somewhere behind them, another woman said something that made several others giggle. Hudson got the distinct impression he was being discussed. "Query," Mira said through the translator. "Do all human males become lost easily, or is this specific to Hudson?" "It's pretty specific to me," Hudson admitted. "But in my defense, invisible signs would confuse anyone." The translator crackled slightly as it processed Mira's response. "Mira suggests Hudson remains on station permanently as amusing mascot. Other females express agreement with proposal." Hudson looked at her sharply, but her expression was perfectly innocent, her markings glowing with barely suppressed mirth. 47 minutes, he said to himself. "I can survive 47 minutes. From across the room, someone dropped something metallic that clattered loudly against the tile, followed by a string of words that needed no translation to understand as cursing. Despite everything, Hudson felt himself smile. Maybe 47 minutes wouldn't be so bad. Mira had appointed herself as Hudson's unofficial liaison, which seemed to involve asking him increasingly bizarre questions while the other women went about their business. The translator device sat between them on the bench, its holographic interface casting faint blue light across their hands. "Query," Mira said, her markings flickering with curiosity. "Human males possess how many respiratory organs?" "Just the 2 lungs," Hudson said. "Standard bilateral setup." The translator conveyed this, and Mira looked genuinely disappointed. "Only 2? Valeric biology includes tertiary respiratory sac for high-altitude environments. Humans seem very limited." "We make do," Hudson said dryly. "Revolutionary concept called oxygen tanks." Query, what is oxygen tank? "A container that holds breathable air for environments where you can't breathe normally." Mira processed this, then her eyes widened. "Humans require mechanical assistance for basic survival functions? This explains much about human fragility." "We're not fragile," Hudson protested. "We're just not built for every possible environment. That's what technology is for." "Technology to compensate for inadequate biology?" Mira said through the translator, nodding sagely. Mira understands now why humans rarely travel to outer sectors. Before Hudson could defend his species' adequacy, Lyria approached with a small package wrapped in something that looked like leaves but shimmered with an iridescent quality. She spoke to Mira, who consulted the translator. Cultural liaison Lyria offers nutritional supplement. Human biology requires regular caloric intake. Yes? Hudson's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly. He'd been too anxious about finding the embassy to eat since he'd docked at the station. Yes, thank you. What is it? Lyria unwrapped the package to reveal what looked like translucent blue cubes, each about the size of a sugar cube, emitting a faint glow. She popped one in her mouth and made an encouraging gesture. Compressed protein matrix with mineral supplements, the translator explained. Formulated for valeric metabolism, effects on human biology unknown. Hudson stared at the glowing cubes. Unknown as in probably fine, or unknown as in might turn me inside out? Mira consulted with Lyria, who made a gesture that the translator interpreted as likelihood of catastrophic biological inversion estimated at less than 7%. That's not as reassuring as you think it is, Hudson said, but his stomach growled again. He picked up one of the cubes. It was surprisingly warm, pulsing gently against his palm like it had a heartbeat. If I start glowing, I'm blaming both of you. He put the cube in his mouth. It dissolved instantly, flooding his tongue with a taste somewhere between mint and starlight, and something he had no reference for. Energy spread through his chest, warm and tingling, and for a moment his vision sharpened, colors becoming more vivid. He could suddenly see patterns in the walls he hadn't noticed before, faint traces of that chromatic spectrum Mira had mentioned. Oh, he said. Oh, that's weird. Mira leaned forward eagerly. Human experiences, chromatic enhancement? I can see more, Hudson said, looking around the room with new eyes. The signs above the shower stalls that had been blank now displayed symbols and colors that seemed to exist between the normal spectrum. The markings on the women's skin weren't just glowing. They were communicating, shifting in patterns that conveyed meaning he couldn't quite grasp but could sense. This is what you see all the time? Affirmative. Welcome to actual visible reality. How long does this last? Mira consulted with Lyria, who shrugged in a universal gesture of uncertainty. The translator crackled. Variable based on individual metabolism, possibly several hours, possibly permanent, data insufficient. Hudson decided not to think about that too hard. He was too busy staring at the walls, which were covered in what he now realized was writing. Instructions, warnings, wayfinding markers, all in that expanded spectrum. One sign near the door clearly read something like communal cleansing facility, female designated, in flowing chromatic script. I could have avoided this entire situation if I'd eaten one of these earlier, he said. Humans do not carry emergency chromatic enhancement supplements? Mira asked. Species adaptation becomes more puzzling. Before Hudson could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. An older Valeric woman swept into the room, her markings tinged with silver that suggested age, carrying a device that looked like a tablet merged with a piece of modern art. She spoke rapidly to Lyria, her tone suggesting this was not the first time she'd been called to document unexpected situations. Specialist Sora has arrived, the translator announced. Documentation procedure will commence. Sora turned to look at Hudson, her dark eyes scanning him from head to toe with professional assessment. She said something that made several nearby women laugh, and Hudson caught the translator's interpretation. Specialist Sora notes human males are smaller than expected based on cultural broadcasts, expresses disappointment. I'm average height, Hudson protested. Sora approached and began circling him slowly, her device projecting scanning beams that made his skin tingle. She spoke continuously, and the translator struggled to keep up with the flow of technical observations. Subject presents bilateral symmetry, limited chromatic display in epidermal tissue, evidence of primitive thermoregulation through liquid secretion. That's called sweating, and every species does it, Hudson interrupted. Auditory organs positioned laterally, insufficient length for optimal directional sensing. My ears work fine. Cranial hair follicles demonstrate unusual density and persistence. Are you calling me hairy? Sora paused her examination to fix him with a look that needed no translation. Yes, obviously. Mira leaned over and whispered through the translator. Valaric females lack extensive body hair. Specialist Sora finds human fur distribution fascinating and slightly disturbing. It's not fur, Hudson said weakly, but Sora had already moved on, her device projecting a holographic display of what appeared to be his skeletal structure. She made a sound of clinical interest and spoke rapidly. Subject skeletal density appropriate for terrestrial gravity environment. Muscular distribution suggests endurance-based locomotion rather than burst capacity. Overall assessment, adequate for baseline survival, unlikely to present competitive advantage in standard scenarios. I feel so validated, Hudson muttered. Sora produced another device, this one resembling a jeweled wand, and pointed it at his face. A beam of soft purple light washed over him, and her expression shifted to surprise. She showed the readout to Lyria, whose markings brightened considerably. The translator crackled with Lyria's words. Genetic analysis reveals human male Hudson carries rare compatible protein markers. Biological compatibility index with Valeric species rated at 83%. Hudson blinked. What does that mean? Mira's markings flashed bright with excitement. Means you not poisonous. Very good news. Celebration appropriate. I wasn't worried about being poisonous, but around the room the news was spreading, and the atmosphere had shifted from curious observation to something that made Hudson deeply uncomfortable. The women were looking at him differently now, whispered conversations growing more animated. Sora made a final notation on her device and spoke to Lyria, who nodded seriously before turning to Hudson. The translator delivered her words with mechanical precision. Documentation complete. Human male Hudson cleared for general station access. However, cultural liaison Lyria requests Hudson consider remaining available for extended observation and potential cultural exchange opportunities. Meaning what exactly? Hudson asked carefully. Lyria's smile was warm, but her eyes held unmistakable calculation. Meaning, Mira said cheerfully, we want to keep you. The door unlocked with a cheerful chime that seemed wildly inappropriate for Hudson's current state of existential confusion. Sora gathered her scanning equipment and swept out of the locker room with the brisk efficiency of someone who had places to be and bizarre humans to document elsewhere. The women who had been watching the proceedings began to disperse, though several lingered near the benches, their conversations animated and their glances in Hudson's direction frequent enough to make him wonder if he should be concerned. So I can leave now, Hudson said, standing up from the bench and trying to project confidence he absolutely didn't feel. Documentation complete, biological compatibility confirmed at a number that still makes no sense to me, and I really should find that embassy before they send a search party. Lyria exchanged a look with Mira that Hudson had seen before, usually right before someone told him something he wasn't going to like. The translator crackled to life as Lyria spoke. Cultural liaison. Lyria advises that human embassy location classified as restricted information due to diplomatic protocols. However, Lyria authorized to provide guidance to lost visitors. Lyria willing to escort Hudson to appropriate destination. That's very kind, Hudson said slowly, but I've already taken up enough of your time. If you could just point me in the right direction. Direction pointing insufficient, Mira interrupted through the translator. Hudson demonstrated complete inability to navigate visible signage. With chromatic enhancement wearing off in approximately, she consulted a device on her wrist. 32 minutes. Hudson will return to previous state of profound lostness. Lostness isn't a word. Translator unit creates new words as needed for accurate communication. Hudson's navigation disability requires specialized terminology. Hudson opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. She wasn't wrong. The chromatic patterns he'd been able to see after eating that glowing cube were already fading at the edges of his vision, the walls slowly returning to their original, unmarked appearance. In half an hour, he'd be just as blind to the station's signage as before. Fine, he said. I would appreciate an escort. Thank you. Lyria's markings pulsed with what he was learning to recognize as satisfaction. She spoke to the other women, several of whom laughed, then gestured for Hudson to follow her to the door. Mira bounced along beside them, still clutching the translator device like it was a precious artifact. The corridor outside was blessedly empty and significantly cooler than the locker room. Hudson took a deep breath, grateful to be out of the steam and the scrutiny, even if Lyria and Mira were still watching him with unnerving interest. "Query," Mira said as they walked. "Hudson mentioned search party. Is Hudson important human? Diplomat? Military leader? Genetic repository?" "I'm a graduate student," Hudson said. "Or I was, before I decided to blow my entire savings on a trip to the outer sectors. I'm absolutely nobody important." The translator conveyed this to Lyria, whose expression shifted to puzzlement. She asked a question that emerged as, "Non-essential human travels to restricted space for what purpose?" "Cultural research," Hudson said, which was technically true even if his thesis advisor had called it academic suicide masquerading as anthropology. "I'm studying interspecies trade networks and their impact on post-scarcity economics. Human travels multiple light years to observe aliens buying and selling objects? When you put it that way, it sounds ridiculous. Translator unit simply reports facts as stated." They turned a corner into a wider corridor where other beings moved with purpose. More Valeric women, a few species Hudson didn't recognize, something that looked like a mobile garden having an argument with a floating geometric shape. Everyone gave them a wide berth, and Hudson realized it was because of him. Valeric women traveling alone or in small groups was apparently normal. Valeric women escorting a human male was worth staring at. "Does this happen often?" Hudson asked. "Human males in the Valeric sector?" Mira consulted with Lyria, who shook her head. The translator delivered the response. "Cultural liaison," Lyria states, "last documented human male presence occurred 6 standard cycles ago. Individual was trade negotiator, remained in designated diplomatic zones, departed after 4 days. Your presence represents statistical anomaly." "I'm good at those," Hudson muttered. They passed through a checkpoint where a security scanner hummed over all 3 of them, bathing them in green light that made Hudson's teeth ache. A Valeric woman in what looked like an official uniform glanced at a display, then did a double take when she saw Hudson. She spoke rapidly to Lyria, gesturing at him with obvious confusion. Lyria responded with calm authority, showing something on her own wrist device. The security officer examined it, looked at Hudson again, then waved them through with the expression that clearly conveyed she was filing this incident in her "weird things that happened today" mental folder. "What did you tell her?" Hudson asked. "Cultural liaison," Lyria explained, "you are lost human male undergoing emergency navigation assistance. Security officer expressed sympathy for your tragic condition." "My condition isn't tragic. I just can't see your color-coded signs." "Yes," Mira agreed cheerfully. "Tragic." The corridor opened into what appeared to be a transit hub, with sleek vehicles that looked like elongated bubbles arriving and departing on tracks that curved up the walls and across the ceiling in defiance of what Hudson understood about gravity. Valeric women moved through the space in flowing groups, their markings creating patterns of light that rippled through the crowd like bioluminescent waves. Lyria led them to a platform where one of the bubble vehicles was docked, its transparent surface revealing plush seating inside. She spoke to the vehicle. Apparently it responded to voice commands and gestured for Hudson to enter. "Wait," he said. "Where exactly are we going?" The translator processed Lyria's response. "Cultural liaison, Lyria, taking Hudson to optimal location for his continued safety and cultural integration. Human embassy ill-equipped to handle Hudson's demonstrated needs." "What needs? I just need directions." "Human male unable to navigate station infrastructure without assistance. Human male unfamiliar with local customs and biological requirements. Human male presenting as unregistered anomaly, requiring ongoing monitoring." Lyria's smile was pleasant and absolutely immovable. "Therefore, Hudson will reside temporarily in cultural exchange housing where proper support can be provided." Hudson stared at her. "You're not taking me to the embassy." "Correct. You're taking me to some kind of, what, observation facility?" "Cultural exchange housing," Mira corrected. "Very comfortable. Many amenities." Previous occupant was crystalline scholar studying Valeric music theory. Left many interesting musical instruments behind. "I don't play musical instruments." Excellent opportunity to learn new skill during extended stay. The bubble vehicle chimed impatiently, its door beginning to close. Lyria stepped inside and looked at Hudson expectantly. Around them, other Valeric women had paused to watch the interaction, their markings flickering with obvious curiosity. Hudson looked at the vehicle, at Lyria's unwavering expression, at Mira's enthusiastic grin, at the crowd of onlookers, and at the corridor behind him that led back into the incomprehensible maze of the station. He could run. He could refuse. He could demand to be taken to the embassy immediately and invoke whatever diplomatic protections his Earth passport theoretically granted him. Or he could get in the vehicle and see where this profoundly weird day was actually heading. "Is the housing really comfortable?" he asked. "Very comfortable," Lyria confirmed through the translator. "Climate-controlled, full nutrition dispensary, entertainment systems compatible with human sensory range. And I can leave whenever I want?" Lyria's markings pulsed in a pattern he couldn't quite read. "Hudson can attempt departure at any time. Successive departure attempt dependent on Hudson's improved navigation skills." "That's not the same as yes." "Translator unit reporting facts accurately." Hudson sighed and stepped into the vehicle. The door sealed behind him with a soft hiss, and the bubble accelerated smoothly into the flow of traffic, carrying him deeper into the station and further from any reasonable explanation he could ever give for how he'd spent his first day in the Valeric sector. Mira sat down beside him, her markings bright with excitement. "Hudson making excellent decision," she said. "Cultural exchange housing much better than boring embassy. Many more opportunities for interesting experiences." "That's what I'm afraid of," Hudson said. But the vehicle was already moving too fast to jump out, and honestly, he wasn't sure he wanted to anymore. The cultural exchange housing turned out to be a suite of rooms carved into what appeared to be living crystal, the walls shifting through subtle color gradients that responded to movement and touch. Hudson stood in the center of the main living space, slowly turning in a circle while Lyria and Mira explained features he only half understood through the increasingly strained translator device. "Environmental controls interface here," Mira said, pointing to a panel that looked like someone had turned a sunset into buttons. "Temperature, humidity, atmospheric composition, all adjustable. Previous occupant preferred methane-rich environment, so current settings may require modification for human comfort." Hudson touched the panel experimentally and immediately began coughing as the air took on a sharp chemical quality. Lyria lunged forward and slapped his hand away from the controls, quickly adjusting them back. The air returned to normal, and Hudson's lungs stopped trying to escape his body. "Perhaps Hudson should not touch things until proper orientation complete," the translator suggested in what might have been a reproachful tone. "Perhaps someone should label things in a spectrum I can actually see," Hudson shot back, still wheezing slightly. Lyria spoke, and her words came through with surprising gentleness. "Cultural liaison. Lyria apologizes. Station infrastructure not designed for human visual limitations. Lyria will arrange for tactile markers in human-compatible formats." "Thank you," Hudson managed. He moved away from the environmental controls like they might bite him. The living space was larger than his entire apartment back on Earth, with furniture that seemed to grow organically from the floor. Flowing benches, a table that curved like a frozen wave, chairs that adjusted their shape when he sat in them. Along one wall, a series of stringed instruments hung in a display that would have been beautiful if Hudson had any idea what to do with them. Mira plucked one of the strings, and the resulting sound made Hudson's teeth vibrate in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. Crystalline Scholar was very skilled musician, gave performances throughout sector before returning to homeworld, left instruments as gift for future residents. "I'm not musical," Hudson said. "Not yet," Mira agreed cheerfully. Lyria moved to another panel and activated what appeared to be a communication system. A holographic interface bloomed in the air, displaying what Hudson assumed were contact directories and messaging systems. All in that chromatic script he could no longer read now that the enhancement from the protein cube had worn off completely. "Communication Hub provides access to station networks," the translator explained. "Hudson can contact embassy personnel, file requests with station administration, or access educational databases. Lyria recommends beginning with basic Valeric language instruction to reduce future navigation incidents." "You mean so I can read the signs?" Translator unit confirming Hudson's interpretation. Hudson sat down on one of the adaptive chairs, which immediately molded itself around him in a way that was either incredibly comfortable or vaguely disturbing. He couldn't decide which. How long am I expected to stay here? Lyria and Mira exchanged another one of those looks. The translator remained silent for a long moment before Lyria's response came through. Duration of residency dependent on multiple factors. Minimum period for successful cultural integration estimated at 20 to 30 standard days. A month? Hudson straightened so fast the chair made a startled, squelching sound. I can't stay here for a month. I have a hostel reservation on deck 47. I have research to conduct. I have a return shuttle booked in 3 weeks. Hostel reservation canceled due to human male presence in restricted sector, Mira said. Station administration already notified. Refund processed to Hudson's account with apology for inconvenience. Hudson stared at her. You canceled my reservation? Security protocols canceled reservation. Mira simply reporting information. And my research? Cultural exchange program provides superior research opportunities, Lyria said through the translator. Hudson studying interspecies trade networks, yes? No better opportunity than direct immersion in Valeric culture. Lyria arranges access to trade documentation, meetings with commerce representatives, guided tours of exchange facilities. Hudson paused. That was actually exactly what he needed for his thesis. The kind of primary source access that would normally require months of diplomatic negotiation and approval from committees that moved at glacial speeds. That's very generous. Lyria motivated by scientific curiosity and cultural exchange principles, the translator said, but Mira's markings flickered in a pattern that suggested she was trying not to laugh. What? Hudson asked. Nothing, Mira said, her voice carefully neutral. Mira simply noting that cultural liaison, Lyria very dedicated to her work. Lyria said something sharp in Valeric that made Mira's markings flash bright with suppressed amusement. The translator diplomatically remained silent. A chime sounded from somewhere in the walls, and a section of the floor irised open to reveal a platform rising from below. On it sat several containers of varying sizes, all covered in that same chromatic labeling Hudson couldn't read. Nutrition delivery system, Mira explained. Station dietary services provide meals based on biological requirements. Analysis from specialist Sora used to formulate human-compatible menu. Hudson should find options adequate. Hudson approached the containers cautiously. He opened the largest one to find what looked like grain, but shimmered with iridescent quality, accompanied by chunks of something that might have been protein or might have been sentient for all he knew. It smelled surprisingly good, like bread and herbs and something earthy he couldn't identify. This is safe for me to eat? He asked. Estimated safety quotient at 94%, the translator reported. What about the other 6%? Minor gastrointestinal irregularity possible, potential temporary chromatic enhancement, slight chance of spontaneous bioluminescence. Hudson looked at the food, then at Mira. I might start glowing? Only slightly. Fades within few hours. Considered beneficial side effect by most species. Helps with navigation in low-light environments. I'm beginning to think your entire species has a very different definition of beneficial than mine. Lyria spoke, and the translator conveyed warmth in her tone. Cultural liaison. Lyria assures Hudson that all provisions meet safety standards. Lyria personally supervised menu selection. Hudson will not experience harm. There was something in the way she said it, a note of genuine concern under the formal phrasing, that made Hudson relax slightly. Whatever bizarre situation he'd stumbled into, Lyria seemed genuinely interested in keeping him intact. Thank you, he said, for all of this. It's strange, and I'm still not entirely sure what's happening, but it's more than I expected. Lyria's markings pulsed in a warm pattern, and she responded with something that made Mira smile. The translator rendered it as, Lyria states that Hudson's presence represents unique opportunity for cultural understanding. Also, Hudson's confusion face very entertaining, provides morale boost for entire facility. My what? Confusion face, Mira confirmed. Expression Hudson makes when confronted with station technology or Valeric customs. Very expressive. Several facility members have requested permission to observe Hudson's adaptation process for entertainment value. I'm not a show, Hudson protested. Not official show. Mira agreed. Informal entertainment only. No admission charged. Hudson put his face in his hands, and somewhere behind him, Mira made a delighted sound. Excellent confusion face just now, she said. Lyria, did you record? I'm right here, Hudson said into his palms. I can hear you. Yes, and hearing frustration adds additional layer of entertainment complexity. Hudson looked up to find both women watching him with expressions of barely contained amusement, their markings flickering in synchronized patterns that he suspected meant they were laughing at him in Valeric. Is this what the next month is going to be like? He asked. Probably, Mira said cheerfully. Hudson should prepare for extensive cultural observation. Also potential additional locker room incidents. Station very large. Many facilities. Hudson's navigation skills very poor. I hate both of you. Translator unit notes Hudson's statement inconsistent with his facial expression and vocal tone. Assessment. Hudson does not actually hate anyone. Hudson's simply experiencing cultural adjustment stress combined with embarrassment. Your translator is disturbingly perceptive. Technology very advanced, Mira agreed. Unlike human wayfinding abilities. Lyria said something that sounded like a reprimand, but she was smiling, and when she met Hudson's eyes there was a warmth there that made his stomach do something complicated that had nothing to do with potentially bioluminescent food. Lyria says Mira should stop teasing lost human, the translator reported. Hudson had difficult day, requires rest in adjustment period. Thank you, Lyria. Lyria also says Hudson's confusion face truly exceptional. Request permission to share documentation with cultural research colleagues. I take it back. I hate all three of you, including the translator. But he was smiling when he said it, and the sound of their laughter, musical and bright and genuinely friendly, made the strange crystalline suite feel almost like home. 3 days later, Hudson stood in front of a conference room filled with Valeric trade officials, his hands only shaking slightly as he held a data pad he could now actually read thanks to the chromatic enhancement supplements Lyria had been providing with his meals. His skin had taken on a faint luminescent quality that made him glow softly in dim lighting, which Mira insisted made him look mystical and important, and which Hudson suspected just made him look like a walking nightlight. The presentation he was giving on human perspectives on post-scarcity resource distribution had started as a desperate attempt to justify his presence in the cultural exchange program. Somewhere around the second day, when Lyria had arranged meetings with actual commerce representatives, and Mira had helped him navigate the station's research archives, it had become something real. The kind of primary research that would make his thesis advisor weep with professional envy. The fundamental disconnect, Hudson said, his voice carrying through the room with more confidence than he felt, lies not in the economic models themselves, but in how different species conceptualize value when basic needs are universally met. Humans still carry scarcity-based thinking because our transition to post-scarcity is incomplete and recent. The Valeric approach, shaped by millennia of resource abundance, treats trade as cultural exchange first and economic transaction second. One of the officials, an older woman whose silver-tinged markings indicated significant authority, spoke up. The translator on Hudson's wrist rendered her question. Human researchers suggest Valeric trade methodology superior to human approach. Not superior, Hudson said carefully. Different. Each system evolved to solve different problems. Humans are still learning that having enough doesn't mean we need to hoard more. You've had centuries to develop trade as art form rather than survival mechanism. We could learn from that, but we can't simply copy it. Our psychology is different. The official's markings pulsed with what he'd learned to recognize as approval. She spoke again, and the translator conveyed warmth. Senior Trade Coordinator Vera appreciates human honesty. Many species claim to understand Valeric philosophy while fundamentally misinterpreting core principles. Hudson demonstrates actual comprehension despite limited exposure. I've had good teachers, Hudson said, glancing at Lyria, who stood at the back of the room with Mira. Her markings brightened, and even across the distance, he could see her pleased expression. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes, with questions that ranged from genuinely insightful to completely bizarre. Yes, humans did still use physical currency in some regions. No, humans did not engage in ritual combat to determine trade partnerships. Yes, that sounded much more interesting than committee meetings, but it wasn't actually how Earth commerce worked. When it finally ended, several officials approached to continue the discussion, and Hudson found himself surrounded by Valeric women who wanted to debate economic theory and ask why humans were so attached to the concept of quarterly earnings reports. Lyria eventually rescued him, politely extracting him from the conversation with promises that he would be available for future consultations. Hudson performed exceptionally, she said, as they walked back toward the residential sector. Mira had stayed behind, claiming she needed to network, but mostly seeming interested in sampling the refreshments. Trade officials impressed by novel perspectives. I was terrified the entire time, Hudson admitted. Fear did not show. Bioluminescence perhaps provided camouflage for stress responses? Hudson laughed. I'm still getting used to glowing. I tried to take a shower last night and scared myself when I saw the light coming from the bathroom. Effect fades if chromatic supplements discontinued, Lyria said, but there was a question in her tone. I know, Hudson said, but I think I'll keep taking them. Being able to actually see where I'm going seems like a good trade for occasionally looking like a lamp. They walked in comfortable silence through corridors that Hudson could now navigate with something approaching competence. The signs that had been invisible barriers 3 days ago now made perfect sense, directing him through the station's complex geography with clear precision. He'd even found his way back to his quarters twice without getting lost, which Mira had declared statistically improbable progress. Lyria, Hudson said as they approached a viewing deck that overlooked one of the station's central atriums, can I ask you something? Questions permitted. Why did you really lock me in that locker room? The documentation thing is protocol. I understand that now, but you could have just held me in the corridor or called security. Instead, you kept me there for almost an hour. Lyria's markings flickered through several patterns before settling into something he couldn't quite read. She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the atrium below, where beings from a dozen species moved through the space in flowing patterns like a living river. Initial response was protocol, she said finally. Station requires documentation of biological anomalies. But continuation of detention? She paused, seeming to search for words. Hudson was lost, confused, frightened. Releasing him into station without support would have resulted in further navigation failures, possibly dangerous situations. So you were protecting me? Protecting station from liability of lost human, Lyria said, but her markings pulsed in a pattern he'd learned meant she was being deliberately evasive. Also, Hudson's confusion face very entertaining, as previously stated. Right, the entertainment value. Additionally, Lyria continued, her voice softer now, human males extremely rare in this sector. Opportunity to observe human behavior, understand human perspectives, facilitate genuine cultural exchange. Such opportunities do not arise frequently. Lyria thought perhaps Hudson could benefit from guidance, and perhaps Valeric community could benefit from Hudson's presence. Hudson turned to look at her directly. In the soft light of the viewing deck, her markings glowed like constellations mapped across her skin, and her long ears caught the ambient light in a way that made them seem almost translucent at the tips. She met his gaze steadily, and he saw something in her expression that went beyond professional interest or cultural curiosity. You wanted me to stay, he said. Lyria thought Hudson should have choice, she corrected. Could have taken Hudson directly to embassy, could have processed documentation and released Hudson to navigate alone. Instead provided option. Hudson chose to stay. Because you made it appealing. Research access, comfortable housing, chromatic enhancement supplements that let me actually function here. Is Hudson suggesting Lyria manipulated situation? I'm suggesting you gave me reasons to stay when you could have just given me directions to leave. Lyria's markings shifted through several colors before settling into a warm golden pattern. Perhaps Lyria recognized that Hudson was not actually seeking embassy. Hudson was seeking purpose, direction, reason to justify traveling across space to place where he did not belong. Hudson opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. She wasn't wrong. He'd come to the outer sectors with vague research goals and vaguer life plans, running from a thesis that wasn't working and a future that felt increasingly uncertain. Getting lost had been almost inevitable. Finding something worth staying for had been the accident. The trade coordinator offered me a temporary consulting position, he said. 3 months, helping them understand human economic frameworks for new trade partnerships with Earth-aligned colonies. Room and board included, plus stipend and research privileges. Hudson accepted? I told her I needed to think about it. Check with the embassy, make sure it doesn't violate any diplomatic restrictions, figure out logistics. He looked at Lyria. But I want to accept, if I can. Embassy will approve, Lyria said with confidence. Vera already contacted human diplomatic staff, permissions being processed. Hudson's presence here, now official cultural exchange program. Very legitimate. You knew about the offer before I did. Lyria may have suggested to Vera that Hudson's expertise would benefit trade initiatives, possibly mentioned Hudson's unique perspective and research capabilities, perhaps emphasized opportunity for meaningful cross-species collaboration. Hudson laughed, the sound echoing across the viewing deck. You've been planning this since the locker room, haven't you? Lyria does not plan. Lyria simply recognizes opportunities and facilitates optimal outcomes. That's the same thing. Translator suggesting semantic distinction exists, but acknowledging Hudson's interpretation valid. Below them, a group of Valeric children ran through the atrium, their markings flashing in playful patterns as they chased each other around a fountain that defied gravity by flowing upward. Hudson watched them for a moment, thinking about his tiny apartment back on Earth, his struggling thesis, his careful plans that had led exactly nowhere. I got on the wrong shuttle, he said suddenly. When I first arrived at the station, I was supposed to dock at the diplomatic terminal in Sector 8. I ended up at a commercial port in Sector 15 instead. That's why I couldn't find the embassy. I was literally in the wrong part of the station from the beginning. Lyria's markings flickered with amusement. Hudson's navigation difficulties more severe than initially assessed. I read the departure board wrong. The symbols look similar. Human visual limitations strike again. But if I'd gotten on the right shuttle, if I'd docked where I was supposed to, I would have gone straight to the embassy, filed my research permits through proper channels, probably gotten access to some sanitized trade data and a few supervised interviews. I never would have ended up in that corridor. Never would have opened that door. Never would have been detained in female communal facility, Lyria agreed. Never would have met Lyria or Mira. Never would have consumed chromatic enhancement supplements or presented research to trade officials or been offered consulting position. Never would have found a reason to stay. Lyria turned to face him fully, her expression serious despite the continued gentle pulsing of her markings. Hudson believes getting lost was beneficial. I think getting lost was the first thing I've done right in a long time, Hudson said. Everything I planned, everything I tried to control, it all fell apart or led nowhere. The one thing I didn't plan, stumbling through the wrong door into the most embarrassing situation possible, somehow led to exactly what I needed. Philosophy suggests universe contains patterns beyond conscious recognition, Lyria said. Coincidence and destiny indistinguishable from limited perspective. Perhaps Hudson meant to be lost. Perhaps Doctor meant to be opened. Perhaps Lyria meant to be there when it happened. Do you believe that? Lyria believes Hudson should accept consulting position. Believes Hudson will thrive in cultural exchange program. Believes Hudson's presence here beneficial for all parties involved. She paused, her markings shifting to a softer, more intimate pattern. Believes Hudson perhaps not as lost as he thinks. Hudson felt something warm unfold in his chest, a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with chromatic enhancement or station protocols. I should probably call my thesis advisor. Tell him I'm extending my research trip. He's going to think I've lost my mind. Has Hudson lost mind? Probably, but in the best possible way. From somewhere below, Mira's voice echoed across the atrium, calling Lyria's name with obvious urgency. They looked down to see her waving frantically from the fountain plaza, her markings flashing in rapid patterns that suggested either excitement or disaster. Mira appears distressed, Lyria observed. Should we be worried? With Mira, worry always appropriate. But Lyria was already moving toward the nearest transit platform, and Hudson hurried to follow. By the time they reached the atrium, Mira had gathered a small crowd of confused Valeric women who were all talking at once. She spotted Hudson and Lyria approaching and pushed through the group, practically bouncing with whatever news she carried. "Hudson must see," she said through the translator, which was crackling with her rapid speech. "Station-wide announcement just posted. Human embassy requesting assistance locating lost citizen. Description matches Hudson. Reward offered for information leading to recovery." Hudson blinked. "They think I'm missing?" Embassy sent 3 messages to Hudson's registered contact address. Hudson failed to respond. Initiated search protocols. Mira showed him her wrist device, which displayed what was apparently a missing person bulletin with his passport photo, looking particularly disheveled. "Reward very generous. Many beings now searching for lost human male." "I should contact them," Hudson said. "Let them know I'm fine, that I was just detained for documentation." "Hudson will explain locker room incident to diplomatic officials?" Lyria asked, her markings flickering with barely suppressed amusement. "I'll figure out something that sounds less humiliating." "Good luck," Mira said cheerfully. "Translator unit suggests no diplomatic phrasing exists that makes accidentally entered female facility and was detained for cultural observation sound professional." Hudson pulled out his datapad, which he'd been using exclusively for research and had completely forgotten could also send messages to the embassy. There were indeed 3 increasingly concerned communications from the diplomatic staff, the last one threatening to file an incident report with station security if he didn't respond within 24 hours. He composed a response that tried to explain the situation while maintaining some shred of dignity. It didn't work. Any way he phrased it sounded either suspicious or ridiculous. Finally, he just wrote, "Safe and accounted for. Currently participating in cultural exchange program with Valaric Trade Liaison Office. Will visit embassy tomorrow to file proper documentation and extend research permits. Apologies for communication delay." He sent it before he could overthink further, then looked at Lyria and Mira, who were both watching him with expressions of barely contained laughter. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," Lyria said, simply appreciating how Hudson's carefully controlled academic life completely disrupted by single navigation error. Hudson's entire trajectory altered by inability to read signs, Mira added. Poetic irony of situation not lost on observers. "You're both terrible," Hudson said, but he was smiling. "Yes," Lyria agreed, "but Hudson's staying anyway." "Yeah," Hudson said, looking around the atrium at the impossible architecture and the flowing crowds and the signs he could finally read, at Mira's gleeful expression and Lyria's warm gaze. "I really am." Somewhere in the station's depths, an announcement chimed, and Hudson's passport photo disappeared from the missing person bulletins, replaced by a notation that the lost human had been recovered and was no longer in need of rescue. Hudson thought that was probably the most accurate statement anyone had made about him in months. He wasn't lost anymore. He'd just taken the long way around to finding exactly where he needed to be, and it had all started with opening the wrong door. Thank you for experiencing this journey with Sci-Fi Pulse. If this story resonated with you, please click the like button and subscribe to Sci-Fi Pulse for more stories exploring what it means to be human. Share your thoughts on the story in the comments below. And don't leave yet. The next story awaits you. Another adventure